To Cara and Ben for your first introductory presentation, please.
Brilliant. Thank you, Svenja, and thank you, Astrid. Really happy to be here and really also happy to be co-chairing this sectoral community together with Ben. I've heard the words strengthening synergies, breaking silos, building bridges. So that's why we are here as the Anticipation Hub. So I'm Cara Siahaan. I'm the head of the Anticipation Hub, recently appointed since the beginning of September. I also have another head. I am not head. I'm the coordinator for early action and disaster risk financing at the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies. So I'm presenting with my Anticipation Hub hat at the moment. And if you are not yet familiar with the Anticipation Hub is a knowledge and exchange platform to facilitate learning, providing guidance around anticipatory action. As a primer, I will play a very short video for those of you who might be less familiar with anticipatory action. Next slide, please. So what is anticipatory action? In the traditional humanitarian response, activities are normally, for the longest time, only implemented after a shock or event has materialized. And then we do the needs assessment, the planning and prioritizing, mobilizing action, mobilizing funding. And we know that this takes more time and decisions are difficult to make because we have to have trade-offs with many other things. Whereas in anticipatory action, forecasting and decision-making framework, established and sometimes pre-approved plans, together with pre-arranged financing, are done in advance of any predicted impact. So we can see when this is taken, when the early warning signs or alert are announced before the impact, we can reduce the needs and therefore reduce the impacts. So essentially, anticipatory action is a set of actions taken to prevent or mitigate potential disaster impacts before a shock or before acute impacts are felt. And these actions are carried out in anticipation of based on a prediction of how the event will unfold. And next, please. So, the next slide. Where are we today in the humanitarian sector? So this is, of course, an update very much from the humanitarian community. So we are working all together in 60 countries, more than 60 countries. So this is just based on the information we collected from our main, let's say, key partners. Those are the IFRC, WFP, the FAO, the START network, and OCHA. So you can see we have a very diverse, let's say, set of activities. I can tell you, for example, in Peru, for IFRC, one of our oldest forecast-based financing projects, we basically anticipate the impacts of cold wave, the health and livelihood impacts of cold wave for communities in the Andean mountains, based on basically the trigger that is using the prediction based on cold wave and snowfall. And you can hear also today, we will have our colleagues from the START network joining up with Leslie from the African Risk Capacity, and also we will hear from the Bangladesh Red Crescent, Saju, and Jesse, who will talk about the forecast-based financing for floods. So I will not get into details about what trigger, what early action, and what financing is used in my presentation, but we hope that we will do a deep dive to help you also understand how this works in practical terms. So what have we learned so far? There has been evidence collected to say that anticipatory action is faster, more cost-effective, and more dignified than traditional humanitarian response. It reduces losses and suffering before they occur, protect development gains, and increases the impact of available funds. And we are collecting this information at the Anticipation Hub. We now have a global mapping of database of early action, which we hope will grow over the months with your help and support. Next slide, please. And why is risk financing important for scaling up anticipatory action? So that's where we are today. We are in the phase where we have moved beyond the piloting that has been done 7 years ago in Togo, in Uganda, in Bangladesh, also together with the partners. And now anticipatory action, when we talk about scaling up anticipatory action, we primarily talk about these 5 things. And this is basically coming up from the recent high-level event on anticipatory action, and also the Anticipatory Action Task Force policy brief, those 5 organizations. So it's about building startup capacity, strengthening early warning and forecast system, fueling or financing implementation of anticipatory action, mainstreaming anticipatory action, learning, evaluating, building knowledge based on anticipatory action. So how do we get there? It's about increasing flexible and predictable coordinated funding at the local and national level. So also supporting government directly through our projects, for example, with the support of national society in the context of Red Cross and with the UN, also with other government partners. Increasing those financing also in the, let's say, global pools such as SURF, DREF, and the START funds. And of course, we want to explore new innovative solutions. And that's why we are keen also in working with the sectoral community members. We want to facilitate using other instruments, including DRF and of course, climate funds, and expanding the donor and bilateral programming to use ex-ante financing for anticipatory action. So this is where we are today. So that is just a quote from the new humanitarian based on the high-level event that we have 75 governments and 60 organizations on 9 September committing to different supporting scaling up anticipatory action through programming and financing. Great, so that's it from my side. Thank you, and back to you, Swain. Over to Ben. Sorry, Ben. You're next.
Thanks, Cara. Yeah, I think it's actually Sophie next. Sophie, if you want to introduce risk financing, and then I can come after you. Go ahead, Sophie.
Happy to, thank you. Hi, friends. It's so nice to have everybody together and to go through a participants list and see you all. I'm sorry we're not in person, but it will happen soon. I had my first anxiety dream about missing a plane last night, so those moments are to come for all of us. So for those who aren't familiar with the Centre for Disaster Protection, where have you been? No, you know us. We're a small organisation based in the UK. We do disaster risk financing, but we're an impartial organisation that doesn't come with our own products, but instead is here to support international community to make better risk financing choices. So if you could just flip to the first slide for me, thank you. So you all know me, we're here for an academic debate about definitions. That's my key area of strength. No, not really. So when putting together this thinking about disaster risk financing and linkages, it actually really helped me focus, because I think for us, many of us in the community, we think about a bunch of triggers, we think about when you need money, we think about what you need it for, and then we go, oh, well, that one's early, oh, that's after the event, and we sort of just you know, it's all about timing, and clearly actually what we need to talk about is about the what and the why, and how we bring these quite similar disciplines and thinking about managing risk together. So we show this slide a lot in our training package, and it's really important because it helps us focus that what we're talking about here is about money, but it's about what we often forget in the DRF community is what that money means, and that money means that you're paying for disasters with money and not with lives. So all of the things that we all know to be true in this community, and our priorities about why this work is so important, I think is incredibly well aligned. But it encourages us, many of us who just only think about financing and think about risk in quantifiable terms, is to really bring it back to the people, and the people there. And I think we'll talk about this in the next slide a bit more. But DRF, similar to anticipatory action, is thinking about what do we know, what can we predict, what can we forecast, what can we foresee. There will always, in the DRF community, there will always be a need for humanitarian response. There will always be those black swan events that we didn't see coming. There will be those things that we didn't anticipate in a way that we would have liked to, because the information wasn't there, or the data wasn't really available. So it's not about doing away with humanitarian action at all. It's about being more efficient and effective with the money that we have to support lives and livelihoods. So just flip to the next slide. And forgive me, InsuResilience Global Partnerships, I just put our 2 definitions up about what DRF is, and they are dense. So we're not winning any awards for accessibility, either of us. But fundamentally what we have here is some agreements within the community about what DRF kind of is, but it's really clear that DRF is actually, it depends on who you ask, is the answer you get to that question. And to some extent anticipatory action as well. And the purpose of this sectoral community is, I would hope, not to get bogged down in the definitions, but to really identify shared incentives, shared objectives. So we have here is it's kind of about the money for DRF, which is the stuff in the yellow. It's about certain risks, the things in the green, so climate disasters, disaster risk, specific risks. Fundamentally, I think it's about money that's arranged before the risk has had detrimental impact. So that's the language in the blue. And then the last bit, which is where the centre comes from in disaster risk financing, is also about paying to reduce risks and paying to prepare for and paying to respond to disasters, which is that bit in the pink. And that's a definitional difference. But I actually think that's something where there's some quite strong alignment between how anticipatory action thinks about its actions and its efforts. So how do we use money to incentivize better risk management, so that we can then say, once the event's happened, we're going to do all these things, or in advance of the event, we're going to do all these things. So it's credibly linking finance to credible plans to respond. And actually the Centre for Disaster Protection goes one step further and says that actually disaster risk financing has to think about reducing risk as well. And we can talk in much more detail, I think, later on about preparedness and things like that. So just to the next slide, please. We've come up with this, what I think is a very helpful organising framework to explain disaster risk financing. So typically, I think DRF to date has been quite top-down, quite technocratic. It's, many of you will be familiar with insurance policies for national governments. But actually, the best disaster risk financing, as we think it, thinks both of that money in. So how do you get money into a system, whether it be to a national government or into a response community, but also how do you get the money out? Because you're only as effective as you help those people who need assistance. So for us, we have these kind of 4 considerations when we think about disaster risk financing. And actually, I find it really helpful. So traditionally, before, many of you know, I worked in the private sector. So for me, I was the money in person. The money got to the client received the money when the bad thing happened, and the client said, thanks very much, I'll take my money now. And actually not linking that to credible plans for response means that we're not really sure what the development impact is of disaster risk financing. We do have some evidence gaps there that we need to work on closing. So just briefly, you need to understand the context. So great if you've got the most sophisticated earthquake trigger of all time, but actually the really big thing that's a priority for the community to manage is flood. You need to understand everything that surrounds those people, disaster risk management, disaster risk reduction, all of those things. And what's affecting the context there. You need to understand the money out systems. So you need the plans in place to get money to people once the disaster's hit and the money's being dispersed. Of course, you need money instruments. This is where typically people feel safest in DRF, is looking through the lens of the instruments, and we'll talk about that in a second. Or typically where much of the thinking has been done. And then the last piece is you need kind of project management processes. So an example that we use a lot is the 2010 Haiti earthquake. Many of you are familiar with CRIF as a risk pool. There was an earthquake in Haiti. The money went straight from the CRIF to the government as quickly as possible within 14 days as per the contract, but the government didn't have the capacity to disperse it, so it just sat in Treasury. So without that credible plan to link the money to a set of actions or a set of surge capacity, then the money wasn't as effective as it could have been. So things like that, we're trying to understand DRF being more than just the instruments. But I think that's important for anticipatory action as well. So if we just go to the next slide, it's a question for all of you, like, where does AA fit on this? Does it fit on this? Is it an approach? Is it a methodology? Are we too reductive on the DRF side when we just say, it's a toolkit, pick your risk financing instrument, implement, and off you go, and here's all your money for your disasters? Are we a bit too reductionist when we talk about risk layering? Because the options as we presented here are kind of money in options, but would we link them to other money out plans? So it's really just a point for discussion as we go through this later, is that DRF is more than just the instruments. They are incredibly useful, but anticipatory action really requires us to think a bit more broadly as well. So I think there's some good linkages there. Just the next slide, please, and there's some animation. So many of you may be familiar with our 7 habits, which is now our 7 keys. So if you just whip through them all for me, actually, Leah, thank you. How can we be effective with DRF? Well, as I said, typically DRF has been seen as this kind of top-down, government-led thing, quite technocratic, very all about the models and the data. I think one of the few things where we are seeing really strong alignment with anticipatory action is around some of these 7 keys that we've highlighted, where we think good DRF focuses on poverty. It also creates power for people at risk. It is constantly improving, and I think anticipatory action and the collaboration with the Anticipation Hub and REAP and others is a fantastic demonstration of collective learning, the openness and vulnerability to share where things haven't gone wrong, so that as a community we can learn, rather than saying, oh, that didn't trigger when we thought it was going to be. Okay, no, it's fine, carry on. And there's 2 that I just wanted to focus on very briefly. So one is being timely. So timely is one of those questions where it depends. What timely is a more helpful way of saying quick, because what's quick, it depends. So I think there's a few things where DRF can learn from anticipatory action as well about what are the strategic moments for intervention? When should this thing trigger? And triggered finance, does it look differently if you're a humanitarian? Does it look differently if you're a national government? Does it look different if you're a development practitioner? How do we see that timeliness? Because I think it's a bit of one of those questions like, what is anticipatory and what is early? And I think that's something that the DRF is examining more and more. And then just the last piece for me was about aligning with the bigger picture. So if you just flip to the next slide, alignment for us when we talk about disaster risk financing is that, and great to have Leslie and Emily here because we actually use ARC and ARC Replica as an example. So you can follow the yellow all the way through. So ARC and ARC Replica do a great job because they consider the other components and the other things that are going on for that individual person in a disaster context. So we need to acknowledge, and where would early action fit on here? I put a thing there, bottom with the question mark. Anticipatory actions and methodologies and approach. But if we had an anticipatory fund in there, if I put the DREF in that grey box, how would it align? How are we designing anticipatory action and DRF solutions to be aware of the fact that there's an awful lot going on in a post-disaster context, both financially, but also as community-led financing as well. National finance, but also community-led finance and everything in between. So we do really need to acknowledge the fact that we're not designing solutions or plans in silos. Again, why this community is really important. To avoid duplication, to have really good learning, really good communications across all of the international players, often acting and local players as well, of course. So alignment may be a way to think about how these different financing pots interact, if it's early anticipatory action, if it's early action, if it's humanitarian financing, if it's insurance proceeds. This could be one organising principle by way which we think about it. For me, it's more powerful than a risk layered approach, because actually the individual is able to interrogate that. As an individual who's affected by a shock, have you got time to think about what layers triggering and when, or is actually thinking in this kind of money in, this money out process, as well as the other factors that are going on that aren't necessarily triggered risk financing, may be a more useful framework for us to think about. And lastly, just one obvious area of collaboration across DRF and anticipatory action is the sorts of teams that you need to put together to do this well. So this is a starter for 10 on the teams that you need, the skills mix, the people that you need to support really good outcomes so that we are better able to manage both from a financial and from an action perspective, these sorts of shocks and disasters. But as I went through this, I realised that actually nobody can do DRF by themselves. Nobody can do anticipatory action by themselves. Well, they can, but I don't think they'd be reaching the development impacts they want. And we certainly can't scale these approaches by ourselves. And as I went through, I was really interested to see, actually, I wonder, is this the sort of team you'd put together for an anticipatory action solution? I think maybe. But that's another entry point when we think about who we need around the table to do great work. So happy to take questions. I think I'm handing over to Ben though before I do. So just some, oh, there you go. Sorry, next slide. Sorry, my fault. So just take a look at that for 10 seconds. But just some suggestions and some food for thought as we move beyond hardcore definitions and actually think about what are our priorities when we begin to align disaster risk financing and anticipatory action, and for what outcome as well. So over to you, Ben, I think.
Thanks, Sophie, and that's a really good point on which to move over to a partnership, which is trying to bring together some of these different components. So thanks, Sophie, for that explanation, and Cara as well for explaining what anticipatory humanitarian action is. So I'm Ben Webster, I head up the REAP Secretariat, and I don't want to take too much time so that we can dive into the discussions themselves and the case studies and so on. But just to explain, next slide please, where this partnership came from. So as Cara mentioned, there have been several years now of agencies and partners working together to deliver anticipatory humanitarian approaches, and all the results are, well, they're overwhelmingly positive that this is a much more effective and efficient way of saving lives, protecting livelihoods, assuring development gains, and a more cost-efficient way of responding as well. And therefore, in 2019, 15 governments and 23 implementing partners came together to say we want to see these approaches taken to scale. And to do that, we need to move beyond the humanitarian sector working on its own to bring in the climate community and the development community as well. And therefore, REAP was born at the UN Climate Action Summit with the aim of making 1 billion people safer by 2025 as a kind of hook or a catalyst to really galvanize the different partners involved, the different stakeholders, so that together we can really start to see these approaches taken to scale. So next slide, please. If we want to see these approaches embedded, not just happening through humanitarian agencies, then target one, we need to see the approaches embedded in national policies, plans, legal frameworks and so on, and that's where target one came from for the partnership. So at least 50 countries are taking a more comprehensive risk management approach, bringing together climate and the disaster risk management. Targets 3 and 4 are really focused on the early warning systems involved, making sure that they are designed with what's traditionally known as the last mile communities at the centre, and making sure that they link up to the risk communication and much more effective ways of engaging with the communities affected by the hazards. And target 2, as you will see, is very relevant to this whole area of ensuring more people are covered by financing and delivery mechanisms, the instruments that are connected to effective early action plans on the ground. And this is where this sectoral community, I echo Sophie's sentiments that we would love to see this sectoral community really diving into how to do this more effectively. So how can we bring together the different stakeholders to really see these approaches embedded and being taken to scale as well? We cannot rely on overseas development assistance, and there are so many other options available as well. So how can we ensure all of the financial resources available are connected effectively to ensure that more people can be covered by early and anticipatory approaches? So we would love to see more partners getting on board to help achieve these ambitious targets. We would love to see particularly more development partners engaged, multilateral development banks. If we're going to see this systemic shift from reactive response in Kara's first slide to proactive risk management, then we're really going to need all of these different stakeholders engaged in that process and working together to achieve these common aims. So I'll leave it there in terms of what the partnership is trying to bring to this, but we really look forward to today's discussion so that we can start to make progress to identifying what are the key collective actions we can take together to start seeing these approaches being taken to scale. But Svenja, I'll hand back to you.
Okay, well, thank you so much, all three of you. I mean, that was excellent. This